your pity and your mercy. I have no use for it.
Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. This time, leave Sauron to me. These were Saruman the White's final remarks in The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, as portrayed by Sir Christopher Lee. Saruman, along with the other representatives of the White Council, had ousted Sauron from his castle in Mirkwood, called Dol Guldur, and his words were a pledge to finish off the Dark Lord's spirit. The Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, is the next time we encounter him, which is actually the first time. Isn't it funny how prequels work in the cinematic world? Saruman, now in the service of Sauron, has become so corrupted that he detains Gandalf, strives for the destruction of Rohan, and raises a hideous army of Uruk-hai to wage war and seek the One Ring. How did the Istari chief sink so low? The films never provide an explanation, and J.R.R. Tolkien never specified an exact period or cause for Saruman's corruption. But for those who are interested, we present the information that Tolkien did offer us in this video. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Exploring the entire lore and origins of Saruman the White. Saruman the White became the first of the Istari, or wizards, who arrived in Middle-earth in the Third Age as an emissary of the Valar. He was the leader of the Heren Istarion and also the chief of the White Council for a while. The White Wizard, however, fell into emulation of the Dark Lord as his talented yet faithless servant, intending to share his glory or to deceitfully grab the One Ring, first due to his admiration of Sauron's intrinsic strength, jealousy of Gandalf, and overwhelming arrogance. In the War of the Ring, Saruman organized attacks from the Orthanc Tower in the castle of Isengard against the land of Rohan, while sapping the nation through his agent Grima. However, the corrupt wizard's troops were defeated, and he was compelled to remain a captive in his own tower, albeit not for long. After being granted permission to depart Orthanc, he traveled to the Shire, where his outlaw minions had taken control and became the disguised local bandit leader. Saruman was vanquished once more by the allied suffering hobbits, and he too was betrayed by Grima for his abuse. His unembodied soul was refused access to the West and remained barren and powerless, a fate similar to that of his master Sauron. He is among the few individuals in The Lord of the Rings who's fundamentally grey, meaning he's neither a faithful servant of evil nor an actual agent of good. He eventually trusts his own advice and plots solely for his own benefit. Saruman was created and added to the plot to explain Gandalf's disappearance in the first installment of The Lord of the Rings, taking the place of the wizard's captive instead of Treebeard. Tolkien, as a scholar, would have known the almost identical sounding name of a historical head of his order, Jaruman. Saruman is the mannish adaptation of the Quenya word Kurumo, his official title as a Maya in Valinor, and Sindarin Kudanir, which is allegedly the same name with the suffix Ndir, meaning man. All names signify cunning one or skilled man, and the original root is Kuru, which means skill. Saruman is a name originating from Old English. The original word Seru means art, trivance, design, or device, and the name as a whole means man of skill. Kudanir Lan, or Kudanir, which means White Kudanir, was his Sindarin name. When he was transferred to Cuivienen, along with the other Guardians, he had been given the name Tarindor, which means high or wise-minded one. He claimed the title of Ringmaker for himself. Previous iterations of The Lord of the Rings depicted Saruman as just a fawning subordinate of Sauron, with the army he mustered not in contest with Mordor's, but from the start in his new master's service. In various drafts, the deceitful wizard betrays Gandalf to the terrible giant Treebeard, or sends him over to the Black Riders. Saruman's previous names in these versions were Saramund and Saramwand, both of which contained the English term mund, which means hand. Ilúvatar created Saruman as a Maya before even the music of the Ainur. He was known as Kurumo or Tarindor in his earlier years in Valinor. He was a mighty Maya of Orlais, like Sauron. Tarindor was a part of the five Guardians dispatched to defend the elves from Melkor's troops after the Valar found them in Cuivienen. It's unknown how long he stayed or whether he joined the Eldar on their great journey. Following Morgoth's downfall, the Valar were concerned about Sauron's burgeoning dominance in Middle-earth. Manwë convened a conference in Valinor, and it was resolved to deploy Maiar as an envoy to Middle-earth to assist the Free Peoples in their fight against Sauron. Most likely in the midst of the Second Age, the council convened soon after the Rings of Power were established. The council decided that these ambassadors, dubbed as the Wizards or Istari, ought to be great peers of Sauron, but they should forgo might and dress themselves in flesh in order to treat elves and men on an equal footing. Curumo, who had been dispatched to the assembly by Orle, offered to go to Middle-earth as an ambassador. He was named the first Istar and was made the leader of their order. Curumo resented his Istari contemporaries even before landing in Middle-earth. Olorin, afterward recognized as Gandalf, did not want to go to Middle-earth, but Manwë ordered him to go as the third Istar. Saruman's envy of Gandalf developed here, because Vardar said that Gandalf was not actually the third. Saruman was tasked with taking Eowendil, afterward known as Radagast, alongside him to appease Yavanna, but he refused to do so, leading to his dislike for the latter wizard. Curumo was addressed in Sindarin as Curanir and in Westron as his most famous moniker, Saruman. His human form, like all of the wizards, assumed that of an elderly man. He wore white robes and had raven hair. Saruman and other Istari landed in Middle-earth aboard a ship in the Third Age during the year 1000 at the Grey Havens, or Mithlond, in Lindon. Their history, nature, aims, and actual identities were unknown to virtually everyone in Middle-earth at the moment of their arrival. Círdan was the only one who understood the truth about their origin and identity, having witnessed their arrival. He chose to give Gandalf the Red Ring, Narya, to help him in his endeavor. Only Elrond and Galadriel knew the true nature of the Istari. After a while, Saruman learned about Círdan's gift and was resentful of it, which fueled his attempt for Gandalf. Saruman and the two blue wizards traveled to the east on Middle-earth shortly after their arrival. He went back to the west after a millennium and a half, just as Sauron's might was gathering strength in Dol Guldur. How did Saruman turn into an evil form of himself? Once the White Council was founded in the aftermath, Saruman was named as its commander in TA 2463. Even so, he sensed Sauron's rise and began to covet and want his power, particularly his One Ring. In that same year, the beast Gollum discovered the One Ring, bringing the Dark Lord nearer to the war that would finally be Saruman's destruction. Saruman spent countless hours in Minas Tirith, studying its archives at this time. It's probable that he surmised there that a Palantir would still be found in Orthanc, Isengard's tower. He volunteered to live in Isengard and lead the West's defenses. This was well received by both the King of Rohan, named Freyleif, as well as Steward Baron of Gondor. Saruman was handed the Ring of Isengard, his dwelling, which contained the key of Orthanc within it, in TA 2759, in the hope that he would become a valuable partner. He rose to prominence in the defense of the West's free lands. He discovered the Orthanc Stone, a part of the 7 Seeing Stones in Orthanc, kept it private and concealed, especially from the eyes of the White Council. Later, he would deceive the Council by hiding his usage of it. The White Council gathered in TA 2851, and Gandalf disclosed that the evil spirit in Dol Guldur was actually Sauron, and that he must have returned, urging an attack there. Saruman, on the other hand, felt that Sauron would really be valuable in his quest. By letting Sauron grow stronger, the One Ring would present itself without the need for any effort on his part, and Saruman aspired to be strong enough to capture it first for himself when that happens. Saruman overruled Gandalf using this approach. Saruman's aim to own the One Ring became evident very quickly. He quickly discovered that Sauron knew more about the likely whereabouts of the One Ring than he had anticipated, and in TA 2941, he ultimately agreed to an attack upon Dol Guldur against Sauron, after which Sauron escaped to Mordor. The Wise assembled once more in TA 2953 to discuss the Rings of Power. It was then that Saruman calmed the council by claiming to know that the One Ring had been forever lost in the Belegare. Saruman seized Isengard and strengthened it after their last meeting and also the demise of Steward Turgon. Saruman, who was envious and scared of Gandalf, sent spies to observe all of his actions. As a result, he learned the location of the Shire and observed Gandalf's involvement in it and began sending agents to the South Farthing and Bree. Saruman, as Lord of Isengard, proceeded to cause trouble for Rohan by assisting its adversaries, but the wise already were distrustful of him. Aragorn advised Steward Ecthelion II not to rely on Saruman for assistance against Sauron. Sauron had officially revealed himself in Mordor, and he had gained connections with Saruman with the use of the Ithil stone that his servants had taken from Minas Ithil. Saruman was controlled by Sauron, now being a slave to his will, as a result of his jealousy for Gandalf and also his ever-growing arrogance and hubris, as well as the usage of the Palantir. Saruman created his own smaller ring in an attempt to replicate Sauron's, using either his new master's expertise or the history of ancient Eregion. The wizard planned to share the Dark Lord's dominion in some way. He would either help in his lord's victory to gain his favor and become his associate lieutenant, or he would mislead him and try to usurp his position by getting the One Ring for his own use. Around TA 3000, his corruption was complete.
Sauron, Lord of the Earth.
What ultimately happened to Saruman? Around this time, Saruman acquired the allegiance of Monarch Theoden's top advisor, Grima, who, after that, advised the ill monarch to do nothing about Sauron's forces' ongoing return. Saruman and Grima's betrayal would have weakened Rohan's military strength and given Sauron leadership of the country if Gandalf hadn't intervened a year later and disclosed to Theoden his right-hand man's actual intentions, curing the elderly king and reviving his political and diplomatic authority. Gandalf landed at Isengard on July 10th, TA 3018. He had dispatched spies to discuss the procurement of something called Leaf from the Shire while preparing for the battle, as well as to hear of any hobbits who had just left in the hopes of discovering who had the One Ring. Saruman kept his true objectives hidden until Gandalf revealed the existence and whereabouts of the One Ring. Saruman insisted on Gandalf yielding to him or Sauron. It was then that Saruman revealed himself as Saruman of many colours. But then when Gandalf chose not to join his new master or disclose any information to him about the ring, he imprisoned him in Isengard. Saruman must have begun to organise his army of Dunlendings, Orcs and Uruk-hai into a significant force during Gandalf's incarceration in Orthanc, as Gandalf came to a still intact Isengard. Gandalf could see Saruman assembling his legions of wolves and orcs in his trenches and forges, both in servitude and in competition with Sauron, from the top of the tower. It is possible that if events had progressed more gradually, his minion Grima would have acquired complete control of Rohan, and the Rohirrim may have been imprisoned or killed. Saruman's plans most likely failed because, like Sauron, he was forced to disclose his position early by Gandalf's eventual getaway, leaving him with little time to complete them. Saruman honestly thought that he would be able to convince Gandalf to support their cause, and he honestly felt cheated by Gandalf when he rebuffed him. Saruman's deceit and apparent devotion to Sauron were eventually revealed to the remainder of the White Council once Gandalf told this during the later Council of Elrond. Saruman soon betrayed his lord, Sauron, by deceiving the Witch King upon his arrival in Isengard. Sauron had dispatched the Nazgul to find Baggins, who had discovered the One Ring and his home, the Shire, years earlier. Saruman professed to be ignorant about the Shire. However, with only his troops, the Lord of Minas Morgul lacked the power to attack the Ring of Isengard. Saruman informed them that he suspected Gandalf knew where the ring was, and the Nazgul left. The Nazgul seized one of his Shire informants in TA 3018 in September, and he told the Witch King all of the wizard's plans, betraying Saruman. He also revealed the wizard's twofold duplicity. They also collected information and maps on Baggins and the Shire. Saruman, fearing being exposed as a disloyal servant of Mordor, focused all of his efforts on ensuring Sauron of his loyalty rather than obtaining the One Ring for his own use. Saruman's aims were thwarted further when he failed to take the ring at Emin Muil, revealing him as a liar to Sauron as well. Saruman was in a vulnerable situation and could only try to obtain the ring or persuade Sauron of his allegiance. As a result, he pursued an aggressive policy of targeting Rohan, attempting to assassinate the king's child, Theodred, deploying spies to intercept Frodo Baggins' journey from the Shire. He also deployed raiding parties along possible paths that the Fellowship of the Ring would travel to Gondor. Ironically enough, one of these groups kidnapped Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took, and took them to Fangorn Forest just in time for the Ents to arrive. Gandalf feared Saruman had also discovered and buried the remnants of Isildur, who had donned the ring before it was lost. Saruman's Shire system failed to abduct Frodo Baggins, and Gandalf led Rohan to triumph. Éomer called a halt to his cruel but only moderately effective raiding expedition, and the Ents took control of Isengard. Knowing he was wholly vanquished, Saruman briefly pondered, repenting for his actions, but was unable to do so at the last moment. Saruman hesitated to leave his castle. Maybe he had hoped to flee, was too prideful to resign to Gandalf, or believed his lord would pardon him. Saruman made one more attempt to entice Gandalf and Theoden to his cause, but he failed. His staff was destroyed, and he was exiled from the Order of the Istari. Left out of the last phases of the War of the Ring and incapable of helping Sauron, he ultimately persuaded his captors, the Ents, to let him depart Isengard, since the powers of his voice remained. On their trip to the north of Dunland on August 28th, they saw Gandalf, Galadriel, and the hobbits. However, they disguised themselves as wandering beggars while Saruman kicked Grima to go on, and he stated how much he despised his master. Gandalf told Grima that he should leave him. However, he didn't respond. Saruman's escape was unimportant since he was deemed weak. On September 22nd, they reached the Shire, where his companion Lotho Sackville Baggins had established his control, unaffected by events elsewhere. He settled in Hobbiton and lived his final years as a small-time bandit lord known as Sharky by his ruffians, establishing a terrorizing regime to inflict himself on the innocent halflings. Even this strategy broke apart once Samwise Gamgee and Frodo arrived. He was finally betrayed and slain on November 3rd, TA 3019, by his own agent, Grima. Saruman, a Maya, had shed his form upon his death. He went westward like a disembodied soul, but a wind from the west forced him away. It seems that his soul was left naked, helpless, and roaming around Middle-earth, much like Sauron, just after the destruction of the One Ring. After leaving Orthanc, King Elisar ascended the fortress with the intention of reorganizing it. Inside, Elisar's troops discovered various valuables that Saruman had scammed King Theoden of. There was a hidden closet that could only have been discovered with Gimli's assistance. It housed the true Elendilmere, which was thought to be lost forever after Isildur died in the Gladden Fields, in addition to a golden chain that was thought to have once carried the One Ring.
Did Saruman the Wise abandon reason for madness?
Saruman in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films. Saruman, played by Sir Christopher Lee in the Lord of the Rings movie series directed by Peter Jackson, is the secondary villain of the Fellowship of the Ring and the principal antagonist of the Two Towers. In contrast to the novels, his devotion to Sauron is absolute, and he's depicted simply as a servant acting out Sauron's orders. He's solely referred to as the White, disregarding his full name, Saruman of Many Colors. Lee is the only member of the cast who has met J.R.R. Tolkien. Saruman declares at the start of the Fellowship of the Ring that he's been completely possessed by Sauron's will and his own ambition for dominion. He imprisons Gandalf in Orthanc after he refuses to join Mordor. Saruman rallies his orcs and commences the preparations for war, as instructed by his lord, by constructing wooden machines and dams, bolstering the ringed gates of Isengard, forging armaments, and breeding Uruk-hai. He faces Gandalf again atop Orthanc, attempting to compel him into bowing to Sauron, but the Grey Pilgrim flees. Saruman uses Crebain to pursue the Fellowship and summons gigantic avalanches and landslides to obstruct the adventurers at Caradhras. At the end of the film, Uruk-hai, in servitude to Saruman, ambush the Fellowship, killing Boromir and kidnapping Merry and Pippin. Saruman's conversations with Gandalf were also toned down in the film compared to the books, in which he was shown interacting with Gandalf in a sincerely friendly manner, in addition to seeming to accept Gandalf's choice of death over having to serve Sauron with some despair, whereas well before his loyalty to Sauron was discovered, he barely concealed his disdain for Gandalf with snarky barbs. In the Two Towers film, Saruman leads his master's invasion in the west of Middle-earth. He is helped by Grima Wormtongue and also is shown to have wholly controlled Theoden. He forms an alliance with the Dunlendings, who assist his orc groups in burning the Westfold. He then gathers a 10,000-strong Uruk-hai army to attack Rohan. Saruman's army is destroyed at Helm's Deep at the film's conclusion, and Isengard is invaded by Ents. Saruman does not feature in the theatrical version of The Return of the King, and Treebeard simply implies that the slain wizard's magic is no longer viable. Aragorn, Gandalf, Gimli, Merry, Pippin, and Theoden encounter Saruman in Isengard at the start of the film in the expanded edition. Gandalf wants to question Saruman, but Grima slashes him at the top of Orthanc. Saruman drops the Palantir as he falls to his doom. The Scouring of the Shire, where Saruman sees his end in the novels, is entirely absent from the film adaptations. At the same time, some incidents, such as Saruman being murdered by Grima before the latter is felled by an arrow, do make a passing nod to the event. Jackson thought The Scouring was a letdown. Although the novel didn't really hint at it, Peter Jackson's trilogy openly portrays Saruman directing the weather to cause the snowfall on Caradhras that foiled the Fellowship's attempts to cross the peaks there. Boromir suspected that the storm and tumbling boulders were caused by evil, claiming that there were fallen voices in the air and that the stones were intended for them. Aragorn and Gandalf assumed it was only natural forces wreaking havoc on Caradhras the Cruel. In the films, he was also shown to have telepathy, as he heckled Gandalf about travelling through the mines, suggesting that Gandalf had already been cognizant that the dwarves had roused the Balrog. And in the movie adaptation of The Two Towers, Saruman utilizes telepathic powers to directly master King Theoden, as Gandalf attempts and finds a way to exercise his influence. Saruman's Staff of Power in the movie resembles Orthanc, his own tower, with a white crystal placed between the spires. It is also utilized as a walking staff and as a sign of his authority. He used it in his combat with Gandalf the Grey. Gandalf the White effortlessly crushes Saruman's staff in the extended version of The Return of the King immediately after Saruman's botched attempt to burn Gandalf. Sir Christopher Lee played Saruman again in Peter Jackson's live-action The Hobbit trilogy. He showed interest in playing Smaug the Dragon. However, the job eventually went to Benedict Cumberbatch. Christopher Lee also succeeded in making Peter Jackson laugh by inquiring if he was still in the film. This alluded to a decade ago when Christopher Lee's Saruman's final scene was deleted from the theatrical release of the Return of the King movie, and he had a fallout with Peter Jackson. Saruman appears for the first time in The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey. He travels to Rivendell for a White Council meeting. Saruman criticizes Gandalf's activities in the attempts to recapture the Lonely Mountain, dismissing Gandalf's reasoning as fishing for difficulty where none existed. He's skeptical of Gandalf's knowledge of the necromancer, and he dismisses it even further when he discovers that it originated from Radagast the Brown, whom he regards as a fool and a shame to the Istari, owing to his mushroom-eating habits. When shown the Morgul blade, Saruman claims there is no proof it came from the Witch King of Angmar. Saruman dismisses all of Gandalf's fears as unfounded, but he adds that he cannot support the dwarves' mission to retake Erebor. However, the dwarves had already departed Rivendell unknown to Saruman. Saruman and Elrond arrive in Dol Guldur after being summoned there by Galadriel to rescue Gandalf in The Hobbit: The Battle of the Five Armies. As Gandalf and Galadriel are besieged by the Nazgul, Saruman comes and asks if she requires aid. Two of the Nazgul move toward him, and Elrond and he begin to confront the Nine. Saruman engages in combat with many ringwraiths, seeming to be capable of handling up to two at once. In the end, he and Elrond defeat the Nine and they flee for a bit of time. After Radagast takes Gandalf away, Sauron and the returning Nazgul stand before the rest of the White Council. Saruman prepares for another battle, but looks to be petrified by his dread of Sauron's strength. Galadriel appears in a frightening ethereal form and engages Sauron in a fight of wills. Saruman seems to be unaware of this, still in awe of Sauron. Galadriel finally triumphs and drives Sauron out of Dol Guldur. After rebounding from his wonder, Saruman observes that although Galadriel has exiled Sauron, it required virtually all of her might to do so. He instructs Elrond to return her to Lothlorien. When Elrond insists that Sauron must be tracked and wholly destroyed, Saruman responds that Sauron would never recover his full strength without the One Ring. He then instructs them to leave Sauron alone. This is probably likely when Saruman begins his descent into evil. Despite his claims that Sauron would not recover his full strength, Saruman was plainly stunned after experiencing his might firsthand, predicting his future loss of any chance of opposing him and his ultimate servitude to Sauron.
I'm good.
Is the stranger in the Rings of Power actually Saruman? Despite being a crucial component of the Rings of Power's whole first season, we still don't have a name for the great magic-wielding mystery figure. Some called him the Meteor Man. others the Dark Giant. In contrast, according to the production studios, his actual moniker is the Stranger. From the minute he landed upon Middle-earth in a flaming ball of fire, people have been making guesses as to who this guy might be, yet nothing has felt definite. But now that the conclusion has aired and many options have been taken out, it's truly down to only 5 people. If you haven't seen the ending yet, there are spoilers ahead. In a July interview at San Diego Comic-Con, the actor Daniel Wayman discussed his experience as the Stranger, saying that the creators were quite clear from the start that they were establishing him as a figure with a really deep and fundamental purpose. He needed to achieve something, and he wanted to accomplish it. Other things gushed out of him as he started to tap into this emotion and feel it deep in his core. The actor believes that was really essential to him. Whether it was clothing, hair and makeup, speech or movement, it all sprang from that primordial, guttural feeling of understanding what he had to accomplish there. He knew why he was here, and that's a great skill to possess as an actor, since some characters never really understand what their mission is. They never truly know what they want. Regardless of what we don't understand about him, Wayman believes that if we stick with him and study his journey, we'll be able to witness how he affects the people around him, which will be dramatic. We'll discover and understand and learn, and figuring out what's going on can take a while. We now have conclusive proof that the Stranger is a wizard or an Istari. Tolkien made it clear that only 5 wizards came to Middle-earth, each charged with assisting the inhabitants of Middle-earth in their struggle against Sauron. Using what we've learned thus far, that short list of 5 is swiftly cut down. It's likely that we're witnessing the White Wizard in a previous incarnation as the Stranger. This character fights with darkness, which he encounters first through the evil he causes with his power, and then more explicitly when the rune magicians try to entice him. We know Saruman will eventually be lured by darkness, but it shouldn't transpire for a long time. Like the other 2, Saruman appears a little earlier in Tolkien's novels, but Saruman, unlike Gandalf, decided to travel to Rhûn during one time to aid in the struggle against evil. Season 2 of The Rings of Power has yet to be announced, but it appears that we haven't seen the end of the Stranger. Perhaps by the time we meet him again, he'll have given a name to himself. What was Saruman like? Saruman appeared to be an adult male with black hair. By the conclusion of the Third Age, his beard and hair were primarily white, with only a few black strands around his lips and ears. He stood tall, had a long face, and had deep black eyes. He would first emerge in a white cloak, which he eventually replaced with a garment that changed colors as he walked. He wasn't a man, nor was he an elf, as men commonly assumed, but a Maya dressed in flesh, an Istari. Simply put, he was ageless and very powerful, but his abilities were limited in their use. There are several similarities between Saruman and Sauron in both personality and conduct. His 2 most notable abilities were his intellect and his voice. Saruman was, in a sense, Sauron's younger brother, having both been Valar of Smithcraft and Maya of Ole at the beginning of time. Saruman resembled Gandalf not just in the way he looked, but also in demeanor. Nevertheless, Saruman was arrogant, contrary to Gandalf, even condescending, and therefore more like Sauron. He viewed himself as being the most formidable of the Istari, with open scorn for Radagast the Brown, patronizing acceptance of the elves and the wise, and outright hatred for lower men. He was no idiot, even if he thought Radagast was. He recognized Gandalf's strength and gradually grew to regard him as an equal, and subsequently as better, much to his chagrin. He grew envious of Gandalf and finally convinced himself that Gandalf was plotting against him, and this validated his own plotting toward Gandalf and the remainder of the White Council, as well as the free people of Middle-earth. Saruman's ultimate purpose was somewhat like Sauron's, such that he, too, desired to become a dictator of Middle-earth, whether by his new lord's side or, more ideally, on his very own, if he obtained the One Ring first. Saruman was probably new to his mission at first and actually believed in working to prevent the comeback of the darkness. However, his ambition and later haughtiness, as well as his envy toward Gandalf and subjugation by Sauron, transformed him into a traitor to the purpose he had once served. His treachery was gradual, as Sauron used his love for power, respect for strength, and jealousy as weapons of control. Saruman persuaded himself that he couldn't have followed any other route, and that he was too far gone to repent. Until the very end, the corrupted wizard solely trusted his own advice and the Dark Lord's false words. Because Saruman must have realized this after Gandalf's very generous terms, he simply became more angry and filled with the fury of failure, hating Gandalf more than anyone else for his collapse.
You should have stayed dead.
What made Saruman so powerful. Mastery of the magic, as it is known in Middle-earth or the Dark Arts, piqued Saruman's attention, especially when it came to power, like the Rings of Power and the distant-seeing Palantiri. He was also well-versed in ancient knowledge about mighty nations like Moria, Numenor, and Gondor. His voice and eloquence were far more persuasive than simple rhetoric. He could affect people's hearts, instill dread, and spread lies when he concentrated this energy on a single person or a set of individuals. Depending on the listener's standing, this spell may endure as much as the speech, or it could gain a grip on them and stay forever. Saruman's speech was so strong that he persuaded the Witch King that he had known nothing about the Shire or the One Ring. His voice, however, was persuasive rather than hypnotic, and the actual risk the voice offered to the listeners was not going into a reverie, but concurring with it. Apart from his speech, Saruman has several other subtle skills, such as giving his orcs incredible speed and motivation from a distance, and establishing his will against every single person in his domain who could resist him. While monitoring the orc party holding Pippin and Merry prisoner, Aragorn notices this ability. Saruman also appears to have the ability to wander around utterly unnoticed by others, as evidenced by countless cases of his doing so. His creeping up on Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas' camp in the Riders of Rohan, his completely unheard entry in the voice of Saruman, and his quiet presence unexpected to the hobbits during the scouring of the Shire are just a few examples. Other abilities include mastery of technology and chemistry, which are undoubtedly distinct from explicit magic. For example, the blasting fire used by his Uruk-hai troops in the conflict at Helm's Deep was probably some type of chemical explosion. Both his reinforced Isengard and his reconfigured Shire spheres of control were characterized by machinery and engines. In this, he aimed to mimic, if not outperform, Sauron, his lord. This predisposition was innate in both of them from the start. His research also included biological topics. He's thought to have crossed men with orcs, resulting in the terrible Uruk-hai, a new species of orcs that are not frightened of daylight, who are a vast improvement over Sauron's thralls. His masculine-looking scouts in Bree were reported to be orc-bred, giving them senses superior to regular men. He also used scavenger fowl in this service, which may be credited to Radagast the Brown, who ordered them to fly to Saruman's stronghold, Orthanc. Because he is thought to be more skilled than Gandalf, particularly prior to Gandalf's rebirth, it's reasonable to believe he would use explicit magic comparable to Gandalf, such as self-created lightning, locking spells, producing fire, and so on. Saruman, following in Sauron's footsteps, tried to construct a ring of power for himself, just as his lord did. This he donned in the War of the Ring, revealing himself as Saruman the Ringmaker. He possessed a thorough understanding and history of the magical rings constructed by Sauron and the elven smiths. Yet, at the time, literally, the entire technique of ring-making had been lost and was known only to his lord. Therefore, Saruman's grasp of the trade was limited. Saruman's ring is thought to be an equal of one of the minor rings in terms of power. However, no information about its power is given. It is also speculated that it too lost its power once the One Ring was shattered, because Saruman's ring-making technique was still founded on Sauron's. Saruman knew of Gandalf's gift, the Ring of Fire, Narya, and loathed it. This might be one of the reasons Saruman wanted his own ring. Conclusion. If the stranger is indeed Saruman, exploring his path and how it adds to his eventual decline makes this transition all the more awful. He begins on a similar trajectory as Gandalf, yet his decisions and desire for power drive him astray. Saruman goes on to view the hobbits as inferior beings. That would be a painless revelation, especially after his connection with Nori. Furthermore, if the stranger is Saruman, it underlines Gandalf's travels and decisions, as well as a continuous motif in Tolkien's works. Every being has the ability to decide between evil and good, or selfishness and selflessness. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.